Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second installment of the community review of DefCore for what we call the scale cycle. So this is pre-Vancouver Summit. We'll spend about 30 minutes giving you some history about what's going on with DefCore with a focus on the latest changes. And then we'll open it up for questions. And of course, we'll take questions in the back channel as we go. And follow along. We've uploaded the presentation to the SlideShare, so you're welcome to watch it there. And if you're listening to this offline, you're going to be listening to the recording. There's another recording if you want to double down on learning about DefCore. So let me just roll ahead and get started. Actually, I'll start with here. So DefCore's mission. It's named DefCore to be a unique searchable topic. Our mission is to define what is OpenStack. So it's the core of OpenStack is the idea. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and in what context we're discussing it. And the objective of this presentation is specifically to engage the community to review what we call the 2015A process. So in Vancouver, the board is going to approve the official DefCore process, which defines how the board manages core. We've spent the last 18 months, if you've been tracking DefCore, figuring out the whys. So that's of interest to you, and we spent a lot of time figuring out our principles and guidelines and how the process is composed. We'll talk about some of that, but a significant amount of work went into sort of getting that ramped up so that we could define how the process should be managed. And then what we want is the community to think about the process and understand it. So we have to give you enough background so when you read what we're doing, it makes sense. And so that's really the objective of today's presentation. The bit.ly link will take you directly to the process document, which is reviewed in Garrett. We'll talk about all those components to it. Before we get down into the details of how the process works, we need to bring you up to speed on DefCore. One of the most common misconceptions about DefCore is that we're trying to reach in and tell people what code to write or what projects to use and things like that, and that's really not the intent. OpenStack as a mark, so saying the word OpenStack has three primary uses. One is community, like user groups, and I'm an OpenStack contributor. So using the word in that sense. The code itself, so being an OpenStack project, being part of the OpenStack GitHub, those are really part of our code use, and there's OpenStack trademarks for that. What DefCore concerns itself with is the commercial use of DefCore. So when a vendor says or a product says, I am OpenStack this or I am an OpenStack cloud, those uses of the word OpenStack are controlled. They're actually managed very carefully by the foundation. And so the foundation needs rules and governance to figure out when people can use that mark. And it's incumbent on the board. The board's responsibility is to make sure that that mark has value and that it means something in the market. If it doesn't mean anything, then in some ways the foundation itself can be in serious trouble about what it does and how it can enforce the mark. So it's very important from that perspective that the foundation and the board maintain commercial control of what OpenStack is. And there's another benefit to doing this, right? We want OpenStack to mean something. And it should matter. It shouldn't just be a matter of legal enforcement of a brand. It actually should mean that you have something that's a reliable platform, something that we can say, this is commonly validated, that if somebody says, I'm an OpenStack product, then there's a level of certainty that that product will work with other OpenStack products. And that's really what our goal has been from the very beginning with DefCore, is not brand protection, but actually interoperability and helping figure out how to make all of our vendor community be able to have OpenStack clouds that work together and have common features, and then foster an ecosystem around those common features. And so we've struggled throughout in trying to make sure our definition has both common validation and common implementation. We'll talk about how we do that, but doesn't impede growth and innovation. So part of our challenge here is to define a stable core, but do it in a way that doesn't slow down the innovative technology that marks OpenStack. So what is DefCore? I'm going to read this because it's a very specific definition we spent some time crafting a year ago. DefCore is a process that sets the base requirements, covering up my last word, for OpenStack products by defining must-pass tests of capabilities and designated sections of code. These definitions use community resources to drive interoperability by creating minimal standards for products labeled OpenStack. So, short definition of what I just spent the last couple minutes talking about. This sort of tries to capture it in a nutshell, and we're going to spend some time really digging into must-pass tests and capabilities and designated sections, and we'll go through that. This started 2 years ago, more than that. We've been working on this quite a while. This principles graphic came out of our the Hong Kong summit, where the board really kicked off the DefCore process. And I have blog posts and actually whole videos dedicated to this one picture. In very quick summary, it defines what we're trying to do and why. And the goal is that we're going to have a common core that covers all uses. So there's one version of core. And then that core includes specific code. So it's very important in this definition that we don't just say it's an API only. It includes code, but we allow people to substitute certain parts of the code. We'll talk about how that works. And then that code is validated by tests. Those tests are community tests. The foundation is not a certifying agency. It uses the tests that are in the repositories in the code base. And the idea is that some of those tests will be required. You must pass those tests. We spend a lot of time figuring out which ones those are. We'll talk about how that works. And then it's important that since we're not a certifying agency, that we allow people to self-test. And we'll find as we go that a lot of the things that we talk about are honor systems, because it's so easy with an open source project for people to validate and participate and be transparent. So when you look at what's going on, we put this graphic together a couple of months ago to sort of explain the process in very broad terms. And there's three core elements: community, vendors, and foundation board to this process. But overall, we really want to make sure that it's open and transparent. Right? It needs to be balancing all these concerns, and one of the ways to make sure it's balanced is to ensure openness and transparency. And this is how we do that. From a community perspective, we're working to build an interoperability map. So it's really important that the community be able to express these are capabilities that are important in OpenStack and widely used, and those are the ones we focus on. We want that feedback so that we put the right things in core. It doesn't help to put things that aren't widely adopted in core. That creates strains and a lot of friction ultimately. Community writes the tests, so we don't come to the community with tests. This actually organically comes out of the community, and it's one of the things that we try and create a testing economy, encourage people to do testing. And then the tests, we work with the community to define the tests into capabilities, and we'll talk about how tests are grouped into capabilities, and capabilities are really not driven by, oh, I think OpenStack should be able to do this. They're driven by, these are tests that demonstrate and prove this capability. And ultimately, the essence of DefCore is that tests are truth. So we believe that testing and validating results is the way to achieve interoperability more than any other type of specification. And it's worth noting, especially in recent times, we've been moving to make Tempest not the only source of tests. So while tests still need to be OpenStack tests, in the next cycle we'll actually be opening things up to allow non-Tempest tests, and a lot of tests are moving around. That's in itself its own interesting topic that we spend a lot of time discussing. Vendor responsibility in here is that the vendors will self-test. So they need to run the results themselves. They need to report it to the foundation. We work to be very clear in pass-fail. So the required tests must be passed for you to be interoperable. There's nothing fuzzy in how we're defining it. And then when the vendors report their results, they get, those are publicly available results. And then in order to make it possible for us to have a wide body of tests, we will have exceptions, and there is an appeals process in the testing. So vendors can say, you know what, this test doesn't work unless you have KVM as a hypervisor, and I use Hyper-V. And so there will be cases where we have to make exceptions, and there's a process for that. But ultimately, you must test your implementation of OpenStack, whether it's a public cloud, a private cloud, or something in between, to use the brand. And that's really what we're driving towards, that when people use an OpenStack cloud, they will be able to say it's been tested against a common set of tests. So we should be able to start providing a lot of proof for vendors and vendors to their customers. And then the OpenStack board is involved because we're the authority on what is core. So we select and score for required capabilities. It's a community process, but it's really managed by the board. The DefCore committee oversees that, and then we publish guidelines. I'm going to talk about guidelines next. And really the board's job becomes to be the arbitrator of which tests are required or not. And it's a logical thing to do because at some point you have to say this is required or this isn't required, and the board is really the ultimate authority for that. And the foundation, which is not the board, people often sort of mix those together. The foundation is managing the brand, it manages products and vendors, and enforces people using OpenStack. The board is a governance body, and so when the board says this is core, it's not the board's job to make sure that the vendors follow that. It's actually the foundation's job. So there's a balance in this where the foundation interacts with the vendors. The board can sit back and talk both to vendors and community sort of neutrally. Okay, so a lot of background. What is the deliverable? So DefCore's deliverable is something called a guideline. And this is a recent change, so if you've been following DefCore in the last couple of months, we changed the process to be more time-based, more like a specification, and less release-based. And so what a guideline is it's a simple definition of what capabilities in code are required to be OpenStack products. And this is a sample of one, and you can go to our GitHub and actually see them. 2015-03, so it's a date. This one was approved in March of this year. There's a 2015-04 that was approved in April. We're expecting a 2015-05 that will be approved in May. And it says very clearly, these are the releases that are covered in this guideline. Here are the platform components. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Here's the things that are the required capabilities. And then you'll notice we have things called required advisory, deprecated, and removed. So in the process, things come in. They're advisory first before they're required, and they're deprecated after we believe they're no longer needed. And so there's a clear entry and exit process for new things to change. So within any one of these guidelines, you're going to have a required set, and then you'll have inbound and outbound capabilities. We wanted to be very clear. We've been using the same concept in quite a bit of the language, so you should expect when you look at a new guideline, you'll see what's coming in. A lot of times the advisory things are much more interesting than the required components, because required usually have been in for a while. It's worth also noting that we have a JSON version. JSON is the authoritative, and it's very detailed with a lot of the detailed list of tests, detailed designated sections, and then we summarize with a RST, plain English summary. That's what, it's much easier to review that, but it's a higher level document, and then the rest is consumed by, the JSON is meant to be consumed by the automated systems. So we have guidelines. Guidelines are really points in time snapshots. And this graphic is designed to sort of help explain that we're on a cadence to release guidelines. The goal is to be in a 6-month cadence. Right now we're doing monthlies to catch up. We'll drop to, we'll do one in May. I expect the next one to be in August, and then we'll be on a 6-month cycle. I'll talk about the cycle in a little bit. The idea here is that a guideline and DefCore itself is not the release item. This is why we switched to timed items, not release items. Because in DefCore, we're really not trying to capture the latest features, just the opposite. We really want lagging features. We want things that have gained popularity and are widely deployed, that are things that people can count on and being stable, and being sort of the core of OpenStack. And if you think about it from that perspective, we will pick up different parts of each of releases over time. And the graphic is really designed to show that we are a trailing edge on the release, and we're not even all of the release. So there's parts of what you see in the DefCore, in the guidelines. We don't even cover all of the original release from Havana or Essex. There's still things for those releases that aren't really considered core. They're additional features. And we can talk at the end about Neutron and Keystone and things like that. We'll have some questions and discussion around that and how that works. Another way to visualize this is if you look at the guidelines, we have this progression from advisory required to deprecated, and then we have a lot of different pieces and parts, and they all fit together. So releases, and actually the concept of release is getting a little fuzzier as we're moving to tags, and that's okay. From a guidelines perspective, it's really a date perspective. We have platforms and components. The OpenStack platform is a very broad term. It's a very general use of the trademark. Components are subsets of the functionality, like compute or object. And then capabilities are the pieces within that. So a set of tests that define an API get rolled into a capability. Those capabilities get scored. And we have a whole process. We actually spent a whole 6-month cycle talking about how we score capabilities because it's so high stakes as to what APIs get included or not. We wanted to be very disciplined about that. And we have a 12-point scoring matrix. If you're interested in that, it's actually a big part of our cycle in this process. And there's a lot of blogs and material that we've dedicated to that, especially in the last cycle where we approved the final capabilities. And then designated sections are parts of the code that you need to use. So you're expected to be participating in the designated sections. Those are the upstream pieces where those are parts of the OpenStack product. It is important to note that OpenStack and DefCore have made a very intentional decision that DefCore includes code of OpenStack. And I really need to stress this. Not everybody agrees with this. This is we have a consensus position on designated sections that is a compromise between people who want all of the code to be included and required for OpenStack products, and there's people on the other side who only want the APIs to be required. If you pass the tests, then that should be good enough to be OpenStack. And so those are really equally, the community has equal split on those two viewpoints. And a lot of people in the middle. And designated sections are really that sort of middle position. Some of the code is required, but not all of it. And if you don't include some of the code, you can't use the OpenStack brand. And it's important to note that is something that we do expect to take up in discussion for the DefCore committee and the board. We had to postpone that discussion until later because we don't have a consensus view, so people had to wait on that. Okay. So what are platform and components? So this was a change that we made late last year. If you've been tracking DefCore, it's pretty logical. So the idea here is that there are pieces in OpenStack called a component that you might want to license all by itself. So Swift has vendors who only sell Swift. And for them, they can use the OpenStack-powered object storage trademark, the more restricted trademark, but they can sell Swift without selling Nova. And we have people in the community who sell Nova without selling Swift. So they would be an OpenStack-powered compute platform, OpenStack-powered compute, and they could use that mark. If you do both, and we have a lot of vendors who do both, then you can be an OpenStack-powered platform, and you have it's a more liberal use of the OpenStack brand. Once again, the foundation enforces this and actually grants people use of the trademark and helps them figure out how they're allowed to use the word OpenStack. It's a controlled word. The purpose here is to show that we have these two levels, and that is reflected in the DefCore mark. It's a little bit different than when we started this whole process. We thought there'd sort of be one OpenStack. If you think about it, this is sort of saying there's sub-OpenStacks, and then there's a master platform OpenStack. So We've actually adjusted from principles based on feedback from the community here. In the previous session, somebody called out Keystone as a TBD. The 1503 spec does not include Keystone because Keystone didn't have any dedicated tests. And so in order to have be a capability, you have to have tests. We're remedying that. The 2015-05 guideline will have a Keystone or one or more Keystone tests, and we'll have an official capability for Keystone that'll be required in the guideline. It's worth noting in the way the guidelines work is the foundation enforces that the vendors must certify against one of the last two guidelines. So right now, 2015-03 and 2015-04, those are the current two guidelines. Neither of them have Keystone, and so vendors could certify products that didn't include Keystone. Keystone is advisory, so in the 2015-05 advisory, that will deprecate the 2015-03, so you won't be able to use that one anymore, and Keystone will be in that one. And then it'll be the 2015-08 that before Keystone is required in both guidelines. If you're looking at, if you want to get down in the details, the way we work this is when we're working on the next guideline, we call it .next. So 2015.next is where we're working on the next guideline. And if it's not approved in May, then that guideline might become the June or July or August guideline. So it's very date-based. The networking pieces are something I'll bring up later, Rocky. It's a great question. And it's one of the things that we're going to be discussing in the next cycle after Vancouver, because it creates some challenges. So which code gets designated? Concept of designated code, people get confused just because of the wording. The idea here is that it's the picked code, and we're not, in no instance here is the foundation being asked to become a police force and show up on site to do code inspections and figure out lines. So designating is meant to be guidance. It's not meant to be use this line of code, don't use that line of code. But the idea is basically the upstream common shared code is designated. And we have, just like everything else, we actually have principles and guidelines that clearly state what is designated and what's not designated and how we pick these things. That's what we spent the last 18 months doing, was all these terms have things that you can go look and say, I know how they're going to make that decision. That's been a big part of nailing down the process, is understanding how we make decisions about this and what rules we use. But this is what it comes down to. So there's certain code that's designated, certain code that's not designated. It's a community-engaged process, but ultimately the board is responsible for deciding which code is in and which code is out. So capabilities, I've talked about capabilities a lot. This is really designed just to help you visualize what we're talking about. So we create a capability block snapshot. And in that capability, there's a list of tests that are included in that capability. And so you can go very clearly back and say, create virtual machine, create machine is a capability. These are the tests that validate that capability. If somebody writes new tests, we can include them in that capability and continually make our definitions of capabilities stronger and more robust by adding more tests. And if new capabilities are added to the product, or individual projects, then we'll group them, part of the DefCore's activity, and then score them to figure out if they become required or not required capabilities. So you can group tests, all the tests can be grouped into capabilities, but not all the capabilities become required capabilities. And I'll remind everybody that you don't become a required capability overnight. You have to be advisory for at least one guideline cycle. And then what we're working towards is not limiting tests to Tempest. So any tests that are in the OpenStack domain could become added into capabilities. You'll see, if you look down at the JSON, we're actually modifying the JSON schemas to accommodate tests from different sources. And of course, if you think about these tests, they're code, they're managed by code, and we actually have to know which test, which point in time which test is being used. So it's been a challenge to figure out how to get all the logistics working for this. All right, so now, given a lot of background, it's time to go and dig into what the 2015A process is. And we'll, running a little bit slower than I did last time, but this will, so another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll be really ready to open for questions. If you haven't seen one, this is a picture of an Austin conference shirt. Dug one out of the archives for people. So the 2015A process. I'll remind the goal here is not to define every single thing. It's meant to make sure that we understand the rules that we're playing by, and there's some room for wiggle. And so actually, it's been important that these are humans doing the process, not machines, and so we want to keep people's judgment in the middle of the process. And I think you'll see that it's been one of the fun discussions we've had as we've tried to craft the rules within the process. So we've broken the process down into time. It's much easier to understand what's going on in that case. And so the way it works is that we have sort of a starting point, which is mid-cycle, where we start with a preliminary draft. And that's when DefCore is really busy identifying new capabilities and scoring them and building up sort of, here's what's coming in. Here's the advisory things that are moving up. Here's the new capabilities that are advisory, and here are things that are deprecated. So DefCore works really hard to do that, and the summit presents that to the board and the community for broader review. And DefCore does not operate as a star chamber by any means. We actually work very hard to make sure that the community has as much input as they want in this phase. This to me is a really fun time where we're evaluating the new stuff, and things are very fluid, and there are a lot of great conversations. But once we come up to that solid draft, then it's expected that the broader community can look at it. So vendors can start testing against the lists. They can start saying, hey, this works for me or doesn't work. They could actually start trying to validate their product and getting being prepared for that guideline to go official and be officially blessed against that guideline. And that's what happens at the end. So after the solid draft is presented, then we're really in a review cycle. During that review cycle, we'll deal with exceptions in community, but ultimately it's going to be presented to the board, and the board will or not approve the guidance. For the most part, we work very hard as a committee to have everything expressed as possible and really do our work in committee. The board is we've had great conversations in the board, and they're very active in monitoring this, but we try not to take too much time from board meetings. When you look at those 6-month cycles, they break down into 4 phases. So I sort of detailed this already. You have guidelines draft phase, and when you look at the actual text of what we've put together, what you'll see there is there's A's, B's, C's, and D's. So the guidelines draft phase has the rules for that. The B section talks about guideline review, which is really where we're transferring into a different mode of operations. In the C phase, we really talk about how we're going to get community and vendor feedback, and then the approval talks about the details of what it actually, who approves it and how they're approving it and things like that. So it's a whole bunch of who does what when and what their limitations are and how results get posted. And I didn't bring in a copy. It's left to the reader to review the document itself, which is exactly what we want you to do. So it's really important for people to take a look at that document, understand it enough to say this makes sense to me or not. And we are now at a point where vendors are validating. We've had our first, I know of at least one vendor who is validated. I'm not at liberty to pre-announce that, but we've had vendors going through this process and validating their products. So this is a big deal for the vendors to start coming in. The foundation is going to really get vendors are actually required in their license to validate, and the foundation is really driving vendors to move through this process. Users can come back and should come back and ask vendors if they validated and how they've passed, and actually see the results and find out where they are in this process, because the users asking for it is going to drive interoperability much faster than the foundation trying to enforce it. And we need help. We need review of the guideline. We need review of the designated sections. And you can even help by running Tempest and then sharing your results and figuring out what things are working or not. There was a project, there still is a project. Catherine and Rocky are both on, and they've been instrumental on the project called RefStack. RefStack was much more coupled to DefCore in the past. We separated the projects a little bit as we've sort of grown and figured out what logistics we need to do. But RefStack's goal is to take test results, compile them, put them in a format that can be reviewed for DefCore, and ultimately upload them and start comparing results. Because I think one of the things that's really powerful is when we can start comparing site to site and collecting really concrete community data about which tests are passing in which scenarios and how broadly. And then we can start making core decisions based on adoption, and it's much less speculative. And of course, like any community process, we want to hear when you don't agree. We want to be in discussions with you, but we also want to hear when you do agree. It's really important for this process to be approved by the community, not just passively accepted. Because at some point we're going to have to tell people no, and we need the community to say, hey, this is the way to govern it. This makes sense to me. So your support, positive, and your feedback, negative, is really helpful for us building a good process, building a great community. And with that, I have a couple of links and references for people to use. Because I've been doing DefCore for so long, my blog has a lot of material to go through. Good. Chris is posting a link about information on reporting. I'm going to open up the mics for a second. Chris, I'll let you talk about that. Chris Hogue is the foundation representative, secretary of the DefCore committee, and he's Chris, do you want to talk about reporting?
Sure. Yeah. This is Chris Hodge, and I'm the interop engineer for the OpenStack Foundation, and part of my job there is to help all of the vendors, successfully run the DefCore tests, and then work with us to, on identity and reporting that back to the community. And so right now, all of the OpenStack powered trademark agreements going forward are going to be required to pass the current DefCore tests. And in particular for the Vancouver Summit, we're going to be highlighting any vendor who passes the DefCore tests in the marketplace. It doesn't have any impact on your current mark status, but if you're interested in being part of that initial group of companies who have run the capabilities and have passed the tests, I would certainly love to be in touch with you and work through that process. I think that's it. And you can go to openstack.org/interop to get more information about that. I dropped a link to that into the chat.
Excellent. And this is really exciting. I mean, we're getting vendors who are providing this information, and soon the foundation will start to publish which tests are being passed by the vendors. Right? Very concrete evidence of OpenStack products. We had one question from Rocky about network, and I will jump back to that. If you have more questions, mics are open, so we can take them by voice also. Rocky, you had asked about network.
Yeah, and that platform versus powered by thing, there was no network that showed up in that. And so is that part of the platform? Is it going to have its own product? I don't know what's going on there.
Why do you ask
Because
the hardest
network's
question?
kind of important to cloud, you know.
It is, and so we felt at the time we did the work, the first pass of work, neither Nova Network nor Neutron were passing the capabilities. So the tests that we had didn't none of the capabilities scored high enough because of adoption or stability for us to put them in. And we started having some discussions about making them their own components, and then making potentially an OR component. So you would have a OpenStack Nova Net component, and this hasn't worked out. I don't really have a strong suggestion here, but I'm talking through what's been discussed. And the Nova and a Neutron component, and then one of the suggestions was to create an OR, so you could choose which component you used, and then the platform would, as long as you did one or the other, you could use the platform. That is, there's some people who have very allergic reactions to that because they don't think that the platform should have ORs in it. It makes it very hard to interop. And so we got to a certain point and decided it was too complex to resolve before Vancouver.
Okay.
And it will be a major topic for the post-Vancouver DefCore committee.
Excellent. Thank you.
Always something fun on that. And so if you have a position on it, think it through. We definitely need networking. I haven't heard anybody disagree with that statement. We need to have networking included, but it's much less clear how to accommodate the drift between Neutron and NovaNet, both in adoption and in functionality or in APIs. So
yeah, and
hopefully we'll hear more at Vancouver.
Chris,
do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, on the networking side too, one of the things that they need to consider is that there are actually a number of tests that implicitly depend upon networking, just like there are a number of tests that implicitly depend upon identity. And so even though networking is not explicitly required, it's implicitly required. And I think that moving on down the line, we're going to see, more direct testing of these capabilities. But right now, we're at a pretty good place, as a first start for identifying what's important and what we're requiring people to have.
Yeah, having more tests would definitely help swing the balance of this. But I suspect Neutron, as always, will be a topic of conversation at Vancouver, and same with the NovaNet versus Neutron question. I can give Rocky what might be I feel like is a cop-out answer, but to me is the right answer based on history, which is we'd really like to see people upload test results, and the test results would tell us which path we make more. It could be that most OpenStack clouds out there are NovaNet, and that's the API of choice. It could be the opposite. And until we start collecting test results that include non-core capabilities, to me that's always been a goal, that vendors would report capabilities even if they weren't core. Then we'd actually have data to say, okay, we should include NovaNet or we should include Neutron, or maybe both. It could be a 50-50 split.
So Rob, this is Catherine. Just want
Yep.
So we do encourage people to test the whole Tempest test suite rather than just the number of the core must-pass test.
Right. And that's a great point, and I think it's really important. We will not achieve the full benefits of this process if people only test the required test. They only report the required test.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that we used to talk about a lot in early DefCore conversations was trying to encourage the community to value tests and want to add tests and put tests into the community so that we have more and more coverage of capabilities, and we really shouldn't be static. It should constantly be growing. And Catherine, I know you're our test czar from capability groupings and watching what's coming in. Do you have an idea on how much growth we've seen on tests over the releases?
In terms of tests, so based on my experiences, testing a non-DevStack cloud is greatly depending on the number of failure that you have. A lot of the failure is depending on because of configuration on both the cloud side and also the Tempest side. So the test time, if you test the whole test suite, the test time could take from 1.5 hours to 4 hours. So there is some test time there, but since this is a test that you start and it will test by itself, it makes sense to test the whole test suite so that we can collect data. And then the number of highest tests that passed that I have seen passed so far on the major project. What I mean major project is compute, network, glance. It doesn't include bare metal, data processing, messaging, all of that. The highest number I have seen so far would be around 1,300 test case passed. Yeah. That's
a lot of tests. And
it is a lot of tests, and it's very encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah, it used to be in the 200, 300 range, if I remember.
Yes. And right now, as we gain more and more experience, we get up to over 1,000. Yeah. Great. And that is because we don't test all the other components. What I mean is like the bare metal. There's a lot of tests in bare metal. There's a lot of tests in database, the newer projects that we're not testing. Yeah.
Right.
And which we can turn off from Tempest configuration.
Well, one of the hopes that I'd had in this process would be that people would leave the tests on and we'd start seeing past results for these new projects, and we could start saying, oh, it looks like there's a high degree of adoption for database as a service, and that might be a capability we should watch for.
Yep, that makes sense too. Yep.
So, and the way the components and platform are structured, it is within it's perfectly reasonable to have a component database as a service that has required capabilities if you want to license that component, but might not be part of the platform yet. So by design, there's a lot of control in how we make things required and when things become required. So both the capabilities can be required, but also moving from the component level to the platform level. Other questions? So Egla, Chris, you guys both seen this presentation a lot. I always miss something. What's the takeaways that you would add?
I think one important thing is that we have weekly meetings every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time, and we really want everybody participating and as much as they can. I know it's a pretty big time commitment if you already have a lot of meetings, but we have a lot of great discussions, and even though we have gone over this process many times, there's always something that was either overlooked or not considered, and we do need fresh set of eyes constantly, and we really need your help. So please join us. We send out email invites to the DefCore mailing list. If you're not subscribed to it, join. We don't send a lot of stuff to it, so you won't be spammed as much as some of the other lists. So please join.
It's very topical to DefCore. So
yes, exactly.
There's not a lot of asking for help and like that. And these are really very real issues that we discuss. These are interactive meetings, they're not just IRC. And we use Etherpads to take notes. But we've talked about a couple major issues that are facing us in the next cycle, and we definitely need people with fresh ideas on how to resolve this, and they're material to our community and to our vendors. Chris, something else?
No, I mean, I think that we made a tremendous amount of progress over the last 6 months since the last summit, and it's really exciting to see the tests and the process and everything else in a place where where we can really we're kind of taking this first step of actually proving that the process works. And so it's going to be exciting to see over the next 6 months, seeing the process in place and watching it grow, not just in terms of the tests that are passing, but how do we find and evaluate and and move this forward so that we're really building a strong tool that gives OpenStack users a way to move confidently between clouds. It's because I think that's one of the original dreams of OpenStack, and and I think this is an important part of that.
Excellent. So if there aren't further questions, we'll give people back a little bit of their evening day. And this is recorded. Please review anything. If you have additional questions, find us on the list. We're very happy to talk about it. Love feedback. Love some comments and reviews in the documents. Please participate. We're looking forward to working with you.
Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you Rob for another great presentation.
My pleasure. Always fun.